We're talking today with Wendall Smits of Byron Center, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, now start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in South Holland, Illinois, right outside of Chicago, 1936. Graduated from school and high school in Lansing, Illinois, and at Illiana Christian High School, and I had a good friend there who had joined the Coast Guard Reserve and pestered me to join. And I had to get in before I was 18 to get into the program that they wanted to get, or that he wanted me to get in at the time.
Okay.
So go ahead.
I wanted to back up a little bit there. Born in 36, what was your family doing for a living when you were a kid?
For the most part, my father, during the Korean War, worked in an aircraft engine manufacturer, which was a Ford plant on the south side of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And after that was a truck driver for the most part. And just to back up, during World War II, he operated a machine in Harvey, Illinois, that made crankshafts for engines that were produced in Muskegon, Michigan, and later ended up in tanks during World War II. So in between, he was a truck driver back and forth.
Okay. Now, do you remember much of anything about the World War II period, or were you too young to be aware of things?
I think the only two things that I remember, one being, you know, the end of the war and how happy people were and what I heard on the radio. Mm-hmm. The other was that my dad had a bad ailment in his hearing, and he was off of work for about a year. He was running what they called an upset machine to make those crankshafts, mm-hmm. and he had to push a floor pedal and then wait for it to, from a hot block of iron into a crankshaft. And because he had this ear problem and he would just drop over in a dead faint once in a while, he was off of work for over a year. Mm-hmm. I do remember that. And he was glad to get back to work and at the end of the war, and was glad it was over.
Right. Okay. And now, what year did you finish high school?
1954.
Okay. Now, you were saying then that you were, while you were in high school, one of your friends was after you, and so you had to actually enlist before you turned 18? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what was this program that he wanted you to get into?
You enlisted for 6 years at that point in time in the reserves, with an obligation that during the 6 years you had to do at least a couple years of active duty. Once I was in and down the road a little bit and getting good grades and doing what I had to do to get promoted, there was an edict finally that said if you stay in for 6 years and you get all of your good grades and you get a progression of advancement, you won't have to do your active duty for 2 years. And once I finished 6, I said, well, maybe I'll go another 4, and that went on. And when I got to 20, I said, well, maybe I'll do 30, and that's where I ended up 31 years.
Okay, so we'll go back now. So if you're enlisting when you're 17, do you need your parents' permission to do that?
I did.
Okay, and what did your parents think of the idea?
My mother was very nervous. My dad was relatively proud of it. Mm-hmm. He was an immigrant from the Netherlands and really loved this country.
Okay. Now, once you enlist, now what happens? How do they process you? Where do you go for training?
Okay. We enlisted at the Customs House in downtown Chicago. And at that point in time, we went to reserve units immediately the following Monday night. Those were done in the evenings at that time. And you didn't go to boot camp until a year later, so I didn't actually go to boot camp until 1955.
Okay. Now, were you still in high school at that point, or did you move on to something else?
I had graduated the previous spring just before I enlisted.
All right. And now, so what are you? So you're in reserve, so you have your evening classes and things like that, but what else were you doing at that time?
Oh, at the same time I was going to college in Harvey, Illinois, just a community college there while I was in at the same time, right. working in the summer.
Okay, so during that first year when you haven't done boot camp yet, what are you doing in the training sessions?
A couple of things I think that were important maybe. Lots of firearms training. and lots of classroom instruction on rescue and search activities. and that was kind of the beginning of the career. That's that's the direction it was going in. So.
Now, were these classes for new recruits, or were these the things that all the reserves and all the men in the unit went to?
The majority of the time was spent by all of the people in the unit, just over and over and over, you know.
So you had Monday nights. Did you have any weekends that you did training, or just those?
Just the Monday nights at that time. It was probably 3 or 4 years before we began to do weekends instead of Monday nights. And that was good. I always thought, because you'd have to make 3 or 4 or 5 trips down to downtown Chicago, you know, from where I lived, as opposed to one weekend. And the other thing I thought that was good about it was that you actually became a part-time employee at a regular Coast Guard basis. And much more productive and much better learning experience than just classes in a classroom.
Okay. So what were you, so as this part-time thing, how did that work? When were you there, and what would you do?
For the most part, we went to local Coast Guard stations in Chicago. At that time, there was one in Navy Pier, right on the end of Navy Pier. There was one in Calumet Harbor, and there was one in Jackson Harbor. And we'd spend the weekend right at that Coast Guard station doing exactly what those regular Coast Guard people were doing.
Okay. So kind of go back, you have your first year, and then so you do boot camp then in 1955? Okay. Where is the boot camp?
Over in Cape May, New Jersey. Probably one of the most humid places in the United States other than Jacksonville, Florida. So.
All right. And what did boot camp consist of?
Again, lots of firearms training, lots of swimming and life-saving instruction, and lots of time spent in the classroom, and lots of time marching out on the parade ground.
Okay. How much emphasis was there on discipline and spit and polish stuff?
Lots of emphasis, I guess. Everybody was required to go to chow in the morning in their white uniform. And when you finished chow, you came back and you changed into your dungarees. And before you went to chow at noon, you did the same thing. And after chow, you did the same thing in the evening as well. Lights were out at 10 o'clock, and reveille was 5 o'clock in the morning. And you better have your shoes shined every night. And wherever you went, you marched. And a couple of petty officers and one chief petty officer ran the show. And the chief petty officer slept in the same barracks as we did, so everybody knew to be up before reveille, because otherwise he was at your bedside waking you up.
Okay. And how intense was the physical training?
For a guy who, you know, had just finished high school and was going to college and probably a little soft, but I learned what my mother had done for me real quickly. Wash your own clothes with ice cold water and ivory soap and rinse them in ice cold water. Beat off the mosquitoes in the middle of the night as you stood watch and so forth. So yeah, you learned a lot in a big hurry.
Okay. Now, the guys who were in there with you, did you learn anything about them, where they were from, what kind of backgrounds they had?
Yeah, there were 2 guys who went to boot camp with me from my unit in Chicago. And then the majority of the rest of the people in the boot camp were from the eastern half of the United States, or I should say east of the Mississippi. Most of those who enlisted west of the Mississippi went to Alameda, California for boot camp. Okay. So yeah, I met, you know, people from New York and New Orleans and Jacksonville, Florida, and all over the eastern half of the U.S.
Okay. Were they pretty much all white at this point, or did you have some?
We had some black folks. We had some Hispanic folks, but for the most part, we're white at that time. Yeah.
All right. And how long did the boot camp last?
Our boot camp lasted 2 weeks.
Okay.
And we were we were there for 15 days, and when we arrived, we left with an airplane from Chicago, went to Philadelphia, and we were going to ride the train from Philadelphia to boot camp. They left us at the train station there for 8 hours with nothing to eat, and that was all part of the routine, I guess. And then when we got to Cape May, We rode from the train station in an old school bus, and we had about 80 people in that school bus, and you know that no school bus is equipped to hold 80 people, so we were all kind of, it was in the middle of August, it was 90-some degrees when we arrived there, so this was all part of the game. We had the first meal late in the evening on Sunday, around 9:30, and it was baked beans and bread. And the chief said, you better eat it all, just go back up there and get more. If you don't, you'll eat it tomorrow morning. And we thought he was kidding. Next morning we got up and they had put it in trays, about maybe 1.5 to 2 inches thick, and had put it in the refrigerator. They cut it and they served it like brownies. So we made sure we ate it the following morning.
All right. And then you talked about weapons training. Was this just small arms?
Yes, rifles and pistols.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, so you're not anti-aircraft guns or big
No,
machine guns or things
no.
like that. Okay. And this is all on land that you're doing this, or do they?
Yes, it was all on land at Cape May. Mhm.
Okay. And then having completed that, now do you just go back to your units and?
We went back at that time, you know, to our regular Monday night unit, and after that we had active duty every year for at least 2 weeks, except for 2 years when I was in. Near the end of the time I was in, Coast Guard Reserve was really hurting for money, so they asked a lot of people to take waivers, involuntary waivers for training, which I did. And then the last year of the 31, I was in the inactive reserve, which meant, again, I could be called up, but I didn't attend any meetings. Otherwise, I went every year for 2 weeks.
Okay. I'm going to go back here to the beginning. So initially you were assigned to Coast Guard in Chicago. All right. And how long did you serve with them that time?
Approximately 2 years there.
Okay.
And then they commissioned the unit in Gary, Indiana. And I chose to go there. We could make a choice. Having lived in Lansing, Illinois, it was easier for me really to get to Gary than it was to get to downtown Chicago.
Okay.
So they broke that unit just about in half when they started the unit in Gary.
All
So
right.
that would have been about 1956, 57, somewhere around there.
Okay. Now, when you were with a unit in Chicago, what was your job or your assignment?
My assignment then was I was leaning towards the engineman training, and working down in the engine room in the machinery spaces. So we had a number of classes, as I was saying before, in small arms training, and so actual small arms training. There was an armory there, and we could actually fire right there in the building.
Right.
But the other half was leaning towards engineering experience, learning diesel engines and all that sort of stuff. And while I was, after I finished the junior college, then I went to work for an organization that was making diesel engines. So that kind of worked together between the two, what I did at work, working in an engine test lab, and what I was doing in the reserves, and that kind of got me into the engineering phase.
Okay. And then when you go to Gary, are you now focusing on the engineering part?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And how long did you stay with the unit in Gary?
21 years.
Okay. Let's kind of take us through some of the different things that you did with them. Did you stay with engineering, or did you change what your assignment was after a while?
No, I went to Gary as what they call a fireman. I would have been E3, and left there as a lieutenant when I moved to Cleveland. But in between, became a chief engineman. I was an E7. There was no E8 and E9 at that time. And then there was an opening in the Coast Guard for about 10 warrant officers in the engineering group. And I don't know, there were a couple of hundred people who took the tests, and I was lucky enough to pass the test. And then went on the Coast Guard cutter Bramble, and got my, no, that was on the Coast Guard cutter Woodbine out of Grand Haven. And I was able to become a warrant officer, and I did that for 2 years. And then again, they were looking for some people as line officers, even though you hadn't completed college, which I hadn't. And again, it was a process of taking the test, and I was promoted to a lieutenant junior grade. We skipped ensign because of our age.
Okay. Now, so how I mean, you seem to have moved pretty well through the ranks here in this career. Was that normal for reservists, or were you a little unusual?
There were some people who stuck with the reserve, as I did, if that's the way to say it. And then there were others who enlisted for 4 years and moved on, and they said, I have enough of this, I'm done, and they moved on. But for those folks who stuck with it, and as I was saying before, if they did what they had to do to get promoted, there was kind of an unwritten time frame. You know, you go from E3 to E4 to E5 to E6 and on up the line. And if you became stagnant in a particular level, the top officers were looking for you and saying, hey, you know, either move on up or get out. However, all of those promotions, all the way from E1 to E7, were all on a written test. And not all the services have that. Most of the tests were about 150 questions, very specific to your particular rate as an engineman and so forth.
Okay, so you had to do well enough on the test as you were going through. So there is a kind of a weed out process going on.
Yes.
It's not just whether you don't get it just for showing up.
No, no, absolutely not.
You have to earn that. All right. Now, you're in the Coast Guard a long time, and a variety of different incidents happen or come up along the way. One of them, I mean, you had, so initially it's the Cold War, and there are different things that flare up in different parts of the world, then eventually Vietnam happens, and so forth. And then in the latter part of your service, Ronald Reagan becomes president, and incidents happen then too. So you probably have kind of an up and down period of sometimes when things might happen and other times they seem quiet.
Yes.
Now, to go back kind of the early stages of your service, what kind of stands out for you? Again, the period when you were an enlisted man, training assignments or any active duty work or anything else like that, what particular things stand out?
Okay, in the early part after moving to Gary, there was a normal progression there in the enlisted ranks up, and as it was for me as a chief engineman. Once I became E6, which would be first class petty officer, and E7, I was responsible for the training of other enginemen in our unit. And then after I had the promotion to warrant officer, which was also an engineering rate, but now as an engineering warrant officer, you're responsible for boilers and all the other things that were on ships at that time. I was responsible for some training at the unit, and also responsible for some training at lifeboat stations. Younger enginemen who were just learning the trade, so to speak, what to do in a 40-foot boat when the engine quit running and so forth. So I enjoyed the time away from the unit as much as I did the time at the unit.
Okay, and then where would you go for, like you have these like 2-week training assignments in the summers or whatever?
Yes.
What places did you go for those?
I think, well, I went 12 or 13 times to Yorktown, Virginia, and Yorktown was a reserve base at that time. It was only reserves, and most of that was for school and advanced school and others. There was engineman school there. There was water pollution school, explosive loading school, leadership school. I was at there twice as an enlisted man, once as an officer, and really enjoyed going back every other year almost to school. In between, we went to operating bases. Was at Great Lakes, Illinois a couple times, Jacksonville, Florida. I was in New York at the captain of the port twice. Once when it was on Governor's Island, and once when it was in Manhattan, right near the Battery Park there. Was in Concord, California at Explosive Loading School. That was during the time when we were bombing Cambodia, and we were loading ships with 500-pound bombs that were all the way stacked in the hold and about 12 high on the deck. and they would run the ships out through the river and out past San Francisco, but they would stop in San Francisco to load provisions. And just before I got there, one of those loaded freighters had hit the pier in San Francisco and put a 12-foot gash in the bow. So while I was there, they started loading provisions way back at Concord, and they ran them right straight out of the river. So, but that was a busy time. We worked about 18 hours a day loading ships with bombs at that time.
Okay. Now you're in a long time, and you're in kind of through. I guess before we get to sort of the Vietnam era, there are some Cold War crises that happen. I mean, there actually had been trouble in Lebanon in the late 50s, which wasn't directly Cold War, but that was one thing that put some units in some places on alert. But then you've got things like the Berlin Wall crisis and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did any of those things have ripple effects that made it to your Coast Guard unit?
I think only at that time, any of those things that you just mentioned, only that we were living under a little more rigid alert, reminded again that, you know, we had orders in our pocket that if anybody was called up, they would expect it to be at their location, at their base, within 24 hours. Most of the time I carried orders in my pocket to be in Juneau, Alaska within 24 hours after I got a phone call.
All right.
And
had you ever been to Juneau, Alaska?
yes, I had.
Okay. So what was up there?
I was just there once on a cruise. So
Okay. You hadn't gone there, and you hadn't seen the base or anything like that.
no, it would have been brand new for me to, you know, go to the base. I'd been in Juneau, but not at the base there.
Okay. And then when Kennedy's assassinated in '63, did that just kind of work the same way?
Yeah, it worked the same way. We're just on a regular high alert, if that's the way to say it. It often reminds me when I hear about the people in Homeland Security today being on a high alert, various different levels of alert. It was much the same in the reserves at that time.
Okay. Now, in '65, the Vietnam War becomes a ground war, and we begin drafting large numbers of people, and there had been a draft in place taking some people, but then that accelerated quite a bit in the next several years. And you had a lot of people trying to enlist in something other than the Army or get into reserve units or do different things to kind of avoid Vietnam. Did you notice any of the effects of that in terms of what kinds of men were coming into your units? Did you have people who seemed to be trying to avoid Vietnam, or did they just seem like the guys you always got?
There was no question there were some people who were there to avoid Vietnam, and there were some people who were there because they were proud to be Americans. That created a bit of a conflict in some units. A number of these people were very outspoken about they were only there to put in their time so they didn't have to go to Vietnam. I only enlisted, for example, they would say to me, I only enlisted so I don't have to go over there. And yet, I know you have to train me, so let's do the best you can, but I'm not really going to do anything. We had two brothers, twins, in our unit, and Gary, and we knew we were going to have an inspection. And at that time, they wore the old Navy uniform. It was exactly the same as the Navy uniform, so you had your rating badge on your left sleeve. And they had taken a rating badge off of their sleeve and had obtained, I don't know where, but had obtained a badge that looked like it belonged on their sleeve, and it had the peace symbol, if you know what that looks like. And we had an inspection from the district office, and I can tell you that the commanding officer from the district office, I thought he was going to kill these two kids when he walked by them. He just walked over to the uniform, just literally ripped it off of their sleeve. But they did their 4 years, and they were gone. That's all they really cared, you know.
Now, did you have people who were sort of actively interested in actually doing kind of home front Coast Guard things? I mean, just the rescue stuff and that sort of, you had people who actually wanted to go and do those things, or were those people go active duty instead?
We had a lot of folks who were very anxious to learn life-saving duties and so forth, you know, especially when we started that augmentation of the regular reserve units. They were very anxious to be boat coxswains and to be enginemen on board the small boats. Really enjoyed it. I did too. When I did some active duty in Chicago, a couple times there at the Coast Guard stations, we went out on search and rescues any old time of the day or night. The whistle would go off. We ran down to the boat after we put our clothes on, and usually we slept with our clothes on, even in the middle of the summer. Run down to the boat and be gone within a few minutes, much like airline pilots do today and so forth.
Okay. And then while you're doing that kind of work with the boats and so forth, are there particular events or things that's kind of stand out in your memory?
Only 2 times, I guess, both of which were recoveries of bodies. Was in Lake Michigan, and that's a tough job for some people. It's a smelly job, and we had one incident in Chicago where a guy had gone overboard off of a ship in November, and his body was floating in April.
Oh.
So I won't get any deeper than that, but you can imagine what it was like. Everybody had to bury their clothes after we got back to the base, and because of the odor, you can't get it out of your clothes. So his body came apart in pieces when we picked him up. So, but we had a lot of rescues.
Okay.
The beaches in Chicago are always busy this time of the year, and people get out just like they do here on Lake Michigan, and don't watch the red flag or ignore it, or want to say, I guess I'm better, I don't have to. Notice that it's there, and they go out, go swimming. But we had a lot of rescues there where there's a strong undertow in Chicago, even stronger than it is here. I don't know if that's, because of the way the lake moves or what it is, but a lot of people were pulled under by the undertow there.
Okay. And you'd have people close enough to be able to actually help, or?
Yeah. When at that time, at least in Calumet Park, and they did also at Navy Pier, they had a large tower that went up probably, I guess, 3.5 or 4 stories high, and we could watch the entire beach. And for weekends in particular, and that's when we were there for training, weekends in particular, at that time, the Coast Guard boats would patrol back and forth, north and south, and back again on the beach. And watch for swimmers. So we had an active presence, and it didn't take us but a couple of minutes to get to somebody if they were in trouble.
Okay, because it has to be pretty quick if they're going under.
If they're going under.
All right. Now, did you have to kind of go out in bad weather conditions? The famous Coast Guard stuff is often, the little boat and the giant waves kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess we were out in some small boats at that time. They were 40-footers. Most of that wasn't bad, but I remember when we went across on the Bramble, when I was there for a warrant office evaluation, went on there, and we left in November. There was a buoy that had come loose in Chicago, and the Bramble was responsible for the entire bottom of the lake all the way up to and including Chicago, and the buoy had come loose in Chicago. We left from Grand Haven, and it's hard for some people to believe, but when we left the river there, the water was splashing on the glass in the lighthouse there. And I know of one chief electrician who was not sick, and we don't know about the captain because he never came out of his cabin. The other 40 guys were sick. And when I got to Chicago and got off, my legs were like rubber, and it was that way for a couple of days. Now, people talk about being seasick in the ocean, but there is a difference on the lake. It comes up in just a couple of minutes, and it took us about 9.5 hours from Grand Haven to Chicago, and that's not even 40 miles across the lake. So
okay.
It was a rough trip.
Manage to fix the buoy?
Yeah, we did fix the buoy. We had another buoy with us, and we placed that one in the right position, and we picked up the broken one and towed it into Chicago. So.
All right. And you also mentioned that at one point when you were in Lake Michigan, there was a massive oil spill in Chicago?
Yes, I don't remember exactly what year that was, but it started early in the morning on the 4th of July, and there was an oil tanker that had come into Calumet Harbor there, or into East Chicago, Indiana Harbor, where the refineries are there. And it was a Polish vessel. He was upset with something that had happened, and he purposely pumped the bilges into Lake Michigan. And that was during the Cold War period yet. And gobs of oil as big as your fist began to roll up on the beach on the 4th of July as the sun rose. And you can imagine millions of people that wanted to go to the beach. And so we were called up for 3 days. And yeah, it was awake on the boat for probably between 36 and 48 hours. That most of us guys were out on the boat. We messed up a screw on one of the boats, so I had to go underneath the water and change the screw. It's a tough job, even when you're above water. So you go down for maybe 3-4 minutes with a mask and all the gear that you need, you know. But it was really difficult to work underneath the water. And I don't take any credit for any of that any more than anybody else that was on the boat. Everybody had a tough job.
All right. Were you still an enlisted man at that point?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. So yeah, you're engine guy. Okay, you go down.
You go down and do this. Yeah, that's right.
All right. I mean, had you been trained to do that sort of work?
I had been trained to change those screws, but not to do it underwater. That was a whole new experience. And you had to learn pretty quick that, you know, you could only be down for so long, and then your arms were fatigued and you had to come up for some air.
So you had an oxygen tank, but it's still just physically moving underwater.
Underwater was tough. All the resistance from the water itself, you know. Yeah. Trying to operate wrenches and screwdrivers and so forth under the water. We dropped the screwdriver, dropped the wrench a couple of times, it was gone. Had to get another one from the boat and so forth.
All right. Now, when you make the shift from an enlisted to warrant officer, I guess first of all, not everybody's going to know what a warrant officer is. It's kind of a peculiar rank. So can you explain what that was?
Yeah, a warrant officer in the naval service, whether it be the U.S. Navy or the Coast Guard, is a specialist in his own right. If I look once in a while at people in the Army, for example, a lot of helicopter pilots are warrant officers. But in the naval service, you're considered a specialist in a particular field. Mine was engineering. The other people who are, you know, operate up on a bridge or whatever it happens to be. And I guess I looked, once that opening was there to be a warrant officer, I said, this is a chance to expand what I'm doing. I was a chief engineman, and that was a lot of fun, and there was a little prestige involved there. You can go to the Chiefs Club. You couldn't do that before and so forth. But this was a chance to do something more than I did as a chief. So on the Bramble, for example, and the Woodbine, that was here in Grand Haven, the Bramble was out of Detroit. A warrant officer was the head of the engineering department on that ship. So it was a chance to do something more.
Okay. What differentiates a warrant officer from a line officer?
A line officer usually expected to be more general in nature as opposed to a warrant officer being a specialist. That's about the best way I can describe it, I guess.
But sort of the separate category, kind of in between conventional warrant officer, kind of in between that and the enlisted.
Yeah, it's a peculiar situation in the Navy. When you're a chief, at that time E7 was the highest. When you're a chief, you're welcome in the Chiefs Club, and there's an aura about being a chief that he's the guy who knows. If you're a young officer, you go to the chief to learn what's going on. And then you become a warrant officer. You're no longer welcome in the Chiefs Club. You're kind of looked down upon in the Officers Club. And I had some strange experiences as a warrant officer. Just a little harassment, you know, the kind of thing that kids might do in college, the freshmen and so forth. Went to the Officers Club one day, and it was in the summertime, and people were dressed either in khakis or in whites, but it was all white from head to toe, or all khaki from head to toe. And one of the line officers who was in there recognized me as being a new warrant officer, and he arranged to have my white cap stolen from the wreck and brought my khaki one there, so I had to go back to the barracks with a white uniform and a cap and a khaki hat, so that kind of thing. But we got past it. We had a lot of fun.
All right. How long did you stay at warrant officer rank?
2 years,
Okay.
approximately 2 years.
All right. But you decided it was be a good thing to do to move up to the next level.
Yeah, I did. Again, as a chance to do something more. And that opened the door for me in 3 different units where I was the training officer. And I was able to actually operate the entire training program in the unit and schedule all the people in the unit for their annual active duty. So it was a chance to make sure that people were going to active duty that was intentional for their rank. And by that I mean if a guy wanted to be an engineman, he went to engineman school or a related school, leadership school, or that sort of thing. So you ran the entire training program of a unit. The unit in Gary had at one time had well over 100 men, so it was a pretty responsible job to make sure that all these people got the proper training all the time to move up, especially those who wanted to move up, if that's the way to say it.
Okay. Now, aside from Gary, I mean, where else did you serve as an officer?
After Gary, I went to Cleveland, Ohio. I had moved on a civilian job and was in a unit there for about a year in an engineering unit, which was really foreign to me. I say engineering. It was the kind of engineering that goes along with inspections of vessels before they're commissioned, all the drawings and the building of a vessel. That was completely foreign to me. I had no training in that, and requested early on that I be moved to a port security unit there in Cleveland. And then I took a job in Owasso, Michigan here, and had to leave Cleveland. So the only opening at that point in time was in Chicago again. So I was living in Ada here at that time and drove 1 weekend a month to Chicago to do my active duty on the weekend. And then there was a unit in Grand Rapids at that time. It was in the Naval Armory on the north side in Monroe. And I made application to move to that unit, and it was okayed. And the month before I was to move to that unit, the unit moved to Muskegon. So I had to drive from here to Muskegon for some time the last year that I was in. But again, it was a chance for an advancement. I became the executive officer there, responsible for the operations of the unit. So.
All right. Now, you had mentioned before the interview that you had sort of one kind of other crisis situation or almost crisis situation that you had gotten into, and that was toward the end of your service, when Reagan was president.
Yes. When Reagan was president and they had the prisoners in Lebanon or the hostages in Lebanon, and they were concerned about getting them out, we were called up at the unit. In fact, I was at work that day, and I got a call 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon to be in Chicago the following morning at Great Lakes. And we went to Great Lakes, and they herded our entire unit and a couple of other units. We had probably well over 300 people there. When we left, we were told to make sure our insurance was up to date, our will was up to date, because we were going to the Middle East. When we got there, they pulled the black shades, and we had a couple of days of instruction, and towards the end of the second day, they told us that they'd be issuing khaki uniforms for us. And that was unheard of in the Coast Guard, any camouflage.
And this is not khaki uniforms, but
a camouflage
uniform,
yeah. And that was unheard of at that point in time. We wore blue dungarees and whatever. And one of the guys in the crew asked the commanding officer, why are we wearing these? And he said, well, you're going to the desert. And this kid said, but we weren't trained for the desert, we were trained for water. And he said, well, you'll only be there a few days. And the kid said, are we going there before the Marines get there and we're cannon fodder? And the commanding officer said, yeah, that's probably a good way to describe it. A couple hours later, they told us we could pack up our gear and go home without ever telling us why or what happened. But there must have been something going on behind the scenes that they decided they no longer needed the Coast Guard or anybody like us over there. So.
Okay. Now, during the Vietnam era, did the Coast Guard take any sort of heat from the anti-war movement, or did people not associate you with Vietnam?
I never was privy to see any demonstrations or anything at our unit. It didn't happen at the unit or any place that I was ever at. We had some people in the unit that I mentioned before that were not so happy to be there, but no, I really never saw any demonstrations.
Okay. If you're just out in public wearing a uniform, you didn't get a negative reaction anywhere?
No, because most of those reserve units that we were in, we ate off-site. We ate our lunch off-site. We would go to a restaurant, be 120, 130 guys eating in a restaurant, all with our uniforms on. Nobody ever bothered us.
You might not bother 120 or 30
no,
guys in a
that's
restaurant
probably
at once
true.
either.
That's probably true.
Yeah, but that part at least you didn't necessarily observe. All right. Now, the port security thing, was that something that you only went to once you were in Cleveland, or had you done that kind of work earlier?
I had done that when we started in Chicago. The emphasis was more on rescue and search, and that lasted about 2-3 years, and then it began to morph into, you know, what are we going to do with the port in Chicago? You know, people think, well, the port of Chicago, what's that? Well, it's not much, and it wasn't much at that time, but we began to see some activities already that were a little disconcerting. And what do we do with these people on the pier who are half drunk and laying around? And do we observe some people on the pier who appear to be drunk, but they're not, and they're just acting like they are, and that sort of stuff? So we began, the captain of port in Chicago began very actively to train port security people on what to do in a port and on the facilities. And that just grew, and all the time, almost all the time that I spent in Gary, I was involved in port security, and that continued in Cleveland and the other units, except for that 1 year in Cleveland when I was in the engineering unit.
Okay. And then, so the port security, was that mostly just dealing with ordinary people wandering around, or did you have to deal with criminal activity or other things like that?
Yeah, we dealt with a lot of criminal activity, particularly in New York when I was there a couple of times, and New Orleans as well. When I was in New Orleans, we had one night that the training officer in New Orleans, my object when I got to New Orleans was to become completely certified as a port safety officer. And the training officer there went on leave without me knowing it, and I was supposed to work with him the entire 2 weeks. I got a knock on my door about 3 o'clock in the morning that said, "Get up, we're going up to Baton Rouge." And I said, "What happened?" I got dressed. I said, "What happened?" There was an enlisted man there, and that was, as I mentioned before, you ask the enlisted man what's going on if you're the officer to make sure and you're new on a place. He said, "Well, there's a Russian vessel that left from Cuba 3 days early. He was supposed to stop in New Orleans and let lots of people aboard, like the State Department and the Agriculture Department or whatever. He was going to load grain, and he roared right through New Orleans and didn't stop." So he said, "We're going up there." So we went up there, and it was early, just about dawn when we got to Baton Rouge. And to make a long story short, eventually the captain and the entire crew of that Russian vessel was detained. They would not allow them off the ship. And the State Department was there, and the Agriculture Department, and the FBI, and I don't know who all, including us. So it was a very new experience for me. Very tense aboard that ship when the captain was told that he was not allowed to go ashore. He wanted people to go to a doctor, and on his crew manifest he had 2 doctors. He wanted people to go to a dentist, and he had a dentist on the crew manifest, all of which were bogus. He had a crew list of more than twice the number of people that was required to run that ship. So you know what was going on. We all know what was going on at that point in time. And he loaded grain eventually in Baton Rouge. And he was escorted with Coast Guard vessels in front and behind all the way to 90 miles into the Gulf. So it was a rough night and a rough day,
Okay.
but a lot of fun.
Yeah. Now, if you're in a place like New York or New Orleans, do you have to worry about smuggling activities or organized crime activities?
Yeah, a lot of the work in New York was on the piers. At that time, the old wood piers. We were concerned a whole lot with activities of the longshoremen, and I don't mean to knock the longshoremen, it's their job. But the old story on the longshoremen in New York was the first 10% that comes off the ship belongs to the longshoremen. And no smoking on the pier. We were on one pier in New York when I was there the second time, where we caught a guy smoking, and he was reported immediately to the supervisor. And when it happens twice, that's grounds for dismissal. You lose your job. And we told him about it. There were three of us guys. We told him that he had one warning, and you know, if there was another, he was gone. We went aboard the ship to inspect the ship. At that point in time, a lot of those inspections were for radioactive material and so forth aboard the ship, and we had all the instruments necessary to do that. Checked all the papers with the officers on the ship, so forth. We came back off, and this guy was smoking again. And the guy was with me. He said to him, "I'm going to your supervisor, and you just lost your job." And as we walked towards the supervisor's office, I heard a scream by the guy who was on my right, and this guy who had just been caught smoking for the second time took what they call a bail hook, kind of a round hook that they would hook nets to pull things off the ship, and he put it right through his back, and it came out of his chest. And luckily we got him to the hospital before he bled to death or anything. But those are the kind of people that worked on the piers sometimes in New York.
So presumably he lost his job at that point.
Yeah, he did lose his job and went to prison, I understand, for some years besides. Which, so it, you know, it wasn't combat, but it could be very dangerous. Could be very dangerous.
I mean, did you encounter any kind of drug smuggling issues or things like that?
No, I don't think that at that point in time the Coast Guard was much involved in it.
Okay.
At least not that I knew of, like they are today. It's a big part of their job today.
But as far as the port security was not necessarily that kind of detective work so much. It was.
No, it was kind of almost a law enforcement activity at that point in time. Here's what we're looking for. If we find it, here's what the punishment is, or you know what's going to happen to you folks that are involved in it.
Okay. Now you mentioned looking for radioactive materials. That seems kind of odd. Got stuff going in, coming out. Any idea what that was about?
There was a concern, I think, at that time in the Coast Guard that there might be, you know, we already had atomic bombs, and was there any smuggling of radioactive material that was either coming in or going out? That was one of the concerns when we went on board the ship. Who's trying to build a bomb that we don't want building a bomb? And we have that same problem today, right?
All right.
It's never stopped.
Okay. Let's see. Now, did you get any kind of sort of awards or commendations kind of beyond the stuff you get for showing up?
No, I got the pistol marksman and the rifle marksman and so forth, but the one that I enjoyed the most was the Coast Guard Achievement Medal.
Okay.
And after spending 21 years in one unit, there were a lot of things I was able to do. One of my tours of active duty was right at that unit for 2 weeks, and one other fella and myself spent the entire 2 weeks, probably close to 70 hours a week for those 2 weeks, rewriting engineering programs and engineering training manuals for the entire 9th District. And that's what the Achievement Medal was for.
Okay. All right. Now, while you were you had your career as a Coast Guard Reservist. What kind of work were you doing in civilian life?
When I was living in Illinois, for the most part, it was marketing support, and the same in Cleveland. And then when I moved here to Michigan, mostly how do I support the salespeople in the organization that I'm working for? Had to do with advertising and sales meetings and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what company did you work for the longest, do you think?
The longest would have been Ellis-Chalmers in Illinois. I worked there 23 years. At that time, they were building engines in Harvey, Illinois, and lift trucks when I first started there. Mm-hmm. And then they built a new engine plant in Harvey, and they built a new lift truck plant in Matson, Illinois. So I worked there for a while before I moved on to Cleveland.
Okay, and then did you stay with sort of heavy equipment manufacturers, or did you do other things?
Yeah, when I moved to Cleveland, we moved to a competitor there.
Mm-hmm.
There were 12 people that, over a period of about a year and a half, left Ellis-Chalmers and went to Baker Material Handling in Cleveland, mm-hmm. and they built lift trucks just like we did there. We saw the handwriting on the wall, I think, at Ellis-Chalmers. Had a beautiful plant, had a great product. We sold more lift trucks to the U.S. government than any other manufacturer in the United States. But we saw the handwriting on the wall that they were slowly deteriorating as an organization, mm-hmm. Ellis-Chalmers in general, mm-hmm. Whether it be farm tractors, construction machinery, lift trucks, engines, whatever. About a year after I left, the business was sold to a dealer in Ohio who ultimately peddled it to a place in Sweden, and it no longer exists. Mm-hmm. So we went to a competitor, and then one of the folks at Baker, who knew me from Ellis-Chalmers, said, I'm moving to Midland Heavy Duty Brake in Owasso. Do you want to come with me? I really didn't want to move again. I was only in Cleveland 3 years, mm-hmm. But I did. And then later on, 1988, they were sold, and they were building a new headquarters in Kansas City. And my wife and family said, do we really want to move again? I said, well, I do, but I knew they didn't. So mm-hmm. then I went to work for a petroleum manufacturer here, or a petroleum distributor here in Grand Rapids, and spent the rest of my time there.
All right. Are you retired now?
Yes.
So when did you retire then?
Last I really worked was about 2 years ago. After I retired on a full-time basis, I worked as a consultant for 4 or 5 years, mm-hmm. and then drove cars for Hertz Corporation between airports, between Grand Rapids and Detroit, Traverse City, and so forth. But about 2 years ago, I said, hey, I'm 78 years old. That's enough. I got enough.
All right. Look back on your career in the Coast Guard. Are there other memories or events or things that kind of stand out? Anything you've got on your list there that I guess we haven't covered?
No, I think you pretty much covered everything. There was one quick thing that happened maybe when I was in a unit in Gary. Just kind of a funny thing if we've mm-hmm. got time for that.
Oh, yeah.
I was teaching a class. I was a chief engineman, I think, at that time, was teaching a class, and there was an announcement over the loudspeaker system that there was an emergency phone call for me. So I turned the class over to another fella, grabbed the phone. It was my wife. We had just moved into a house that we had bought. It was an old house, and had fixed it up and mm-hmm. just painted the bedroom and all that sort of stuff. And it was white, and she had a new bedspread, so forth. She said, there's a bird in the bedroom. I said, I'm 22 miles away. What do you want me to do with the bird? So she called her father, who lived next door. He came over with a broom. He was going to beat it to death in the bedroom. She said, no, you aren't. So we knew that the police department had, forgot what they call that, a gun that kills or doesn't kill animals.
Like a tranquilizer or
yeah,
something like
tranquilizer. We knew that. So she said, and when I hung up, I said, what do you want me to do? She said, I'll take care of it. So she dialed the police and said, I've got a bird in my bedroom. Can you bring the tranquilizer gun over? And the cop said, lady, this is not for birds. This is for animals. And she said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, open the window. And she did, and the bird flew out. So I'll never forget it. I'll never forget what I was doing that day. It was really, I could go on about that story for hours, but that's it.
All right. Now, overall, what do you think you took out of your time with the Coast Guard? What did you learn from it, or how did it affect you?
I think that leadership was the most important thing. It went hand in hand with my civilian job. The last civilian job that I had at Midland, we purchased 9 companies in 8 years and melded them into the organization. So there was a constant turmoil, change of people to work with. My boss at one time, who was my boss for all except about 6 months at Midland, when we had purchased a company in Syracuse, New York. He moved to Syracuse and was there for about 1.5 years. So our only communication was every 2 or 3 months we'd meet in an airport somewhere to discuss what was going on. Otherwise, everything happened on the phone. And I think the Coast Guard really contributed to that, being able to be a leader and at the same time, as an officer, in some cases, to act on your own, which I then did in civilian life.
Okay.
But I think overall, love of country was really the main factor.
All right. But now you reminded me of another question I wanted to bring in. You, as an enlisted man staying in one place for a long time, you would have, and then eventually an officer, but you would have seen a lot of changes in command and things like that. How common was it for, say, you were Gary for 21 years, for base commanders or high-ranking people to kind of move on or change positions?
Commanding officers of most of the reserve units at that time had the job for about 3 years. So I saw about 5 or 6, maybe 7 in that time that I was there. But that was kind of an unwritten rule. Every 3 years we had a new commanding officer. And there was a way for those folks to move on too. They then became inspectors for the district office, became training people for the district office where they would write training programs and so forth. So many of those folks got 20, 25, 30 years in as well.
Okay. Now, was it always kind of an adventure when a new guy came in? Did they kind of come in and want to show who was boss, or did they just want to fit in? Or
a little bit of everything, I guess. But for the most part, you knew who those people were because they would be an executive officer before being promoted to be the commanding officer of a unit. So if you were there with them, as I was, you knew those folks for at least 5, 6 years before they became commanding officer, training unit, then executive officer, and then commanding officer.
okay, so it's not like they're usually coming in from the outside, or
Rarely.
total unknowns when they come in.
Rarely. That did happen at the unit in Muskegon. The commanding officer there lived in Detroit, so he drove from Detroit to Muskegon for his weekends. And I lived in Ada and drove over there. There was another officer, training officer, who drove from Flint. So, and those are all 3 of us were new at that unit, all at the same time, all on the same day. That was a little hairy.
And so when you go into a situation like that, how do you handle it or deal with the personnel who are already there?
I guess at that point in time, you know, I had been in for 29 years, and I often thought about it on the active duty that you went on each year for 2 weeks. My feeling was that when you arrived there on Sunday, you better find out who you're living with and who you can live with and who you don't think you can live with, because you're going to be sleeping in the same place for 2 weeks. You're going to eat with them. You're going to go on liberty with them, whatever. So by that time, you had done it so many times it really didn't bother you.
Now, does it help that the Coast Guard is a relatively small group, with a kind of a standard way of doing things that's pretty common from one place to another?
Yeah, if you get transferred from one ship to another, many of the things are the same, or if you get transferred from one base to another, things are pretty much the same. I've been at the Coast Guard bases as a civilian. I've been on Maui and in Honolulu, and they operate the same as they do in Chicago or over here in Grand Haven.
All right. Well, you got a good story, and you lay it out very nicely for us. I'd just like to close here by thanking you for taking the time to come in and share it today.
I appreciate it,
All right.
and I hope it inspires some other folks to join.